All right, so just before we start and going a lot deeper on all of the things that are new with materials in Vray 5.1, there's one thing I do want to mention and cover, and that is there's a pretty good chance that if you've been working with ArcViz renderings, you're probably well aware that we have been using the sRGB workflow, but there has been another type of a workflow, namely the ACES workflow. Now, what is actually the ACES workflow and how can we use it? Well, before we explain what it is, we might as well say what it is not. It is not a magical thing that will somehow make your renders look better by just clicking on a button. Instead, it is a way that the color management is done. And the reason why this is very important is because in the movie industry, as well as the digital motion pictures, it kind of lacked a universal color management system. So back at 2004, ACES was developed basically to deal with this issue and to create a color throughout the life cycle of a motion picture or television production. Now, in layman's terms, what ACES is basically a way to have a unified color management, which will actually help us get a much more contrasty and vibrant image. And the way this is different is that by using just the sRGB, the gamma curve is the standard for most images, while if we're using ACES, they managed to fix this issue by using a S-shaped curve that emulates films, which are basically giving it a high contrast in the midtones and making the image look much more appealing and contrasty without having to do a lot of post-production on the actual render. So having said all of this, let's see how do we turn on and enable ACES to use with Vray. So the first thing we need to do is we need to go into our settings. So by pressing F10 or pressing the button over here, we go over to our render setup. Now in here, what we want to do is we want to go to settings, and here, like we said, ACES is a color management. So we open up our color management and we can see the default one is rendering RGB primaries with sRGB. We click over here, we have ACES CG. So the first thing we need to do is change it here. Now we can choose to enable this option, but for now I'm going to leave it off, and I will tell you later on as to when you might want to turn this thing on. So for now I'm going to close it off, and this is the first thing. Now the second place where you want to apply the ACES is going to be your VFB, which is this, and now open up on the left side here, so you can actually see the stats over here. And you have the display correction option. When you go over here, what you want to do is under display correction, from sRGB, you want to switch over to OCIO. Now, once you do this, you're going to notice that something changes here. And the reason why this changes is because now we need to input a file or OCIO file. Now, the way that you get this file is you need to go over and download that thing from GitHub. I'm going to open up here, and there you go. I'm going to leave this as a link in the description of the video so you can check it out. You can grab it directly from the link, or you can just Google Open Color IO configs. And from GitHub, you can just go ahead and download the entire code. In here, you have all the different values here. You have 103, 101, 102. There we go. And once you download this thing, what you want to do is you want to click on the button where it says Browse. Then go to the folder that you downloaded it, and from the ACES 103, you can download the config, or you can select the config OCIO. Just click on Open. Now, as soon as this thing is done, what you need to do is you need to change some of the options in here. Namely, the first thing, you have the input color space. You want to change it from raw all the way up to ACES CG. Make sure you're selecting the right one, not the other ones. So ACES CG, display device stays on ACES, and from here, from the view transform, it goes from raw to sRGB. So as soon as you've done this, you're going to get a different look in your scene. So now, next thing we want to do is we want to go ahead and cover all of our other bases. Now, what this means is that in order for this thing to work with the ACES CG workflow, what we need to do is we need to open up materials. So what I'm going to do is select the top here in this one, and I'm just going to apply this material to both of them. So assign to selection. There we go. And I'm going to start my real-time rendering. All right, there we go. Now, what we need to do is we need to go ahead and apply the ACES workflow to our maps as well. For example, in this case, what is happening is that this material doesn't have anything applied to it. But let's just say that what happens if we have a bitmap driving the diffuse, which is basically making it look like this, and I have another one going into the bump map. So basically what we have in here at the moment is 3 different maps, and all of those 3 maps are different in a way that the first one is basically a color map. So what happens is once we have this thing selected, there are 2 things that we need to make sure they are set up so you can use ACES correctly. And the first one is the RGB primaries, and the second one is the color space transfer. Now, if you scroll on the right side here, scroll down, you can see both of them right here. The first one says RGB color space, and the second one is color space transfer function. Now, each of these maps are going to have a slightly different input, namely, all of the color data that you have in here. So for the RGB primaries in here, what you want to choose is sRGB primaries, or the default one. And for the color space transfer, here you want to have from 3ds Max or the sRGB. By default is the from 3ds Max, so you don't really have to change this at all. Now, the second type is your data inputs. Now, this is your roughness map or your bump maps. In this case, it's this image, and it looks like this. So, just a raw data, so it doesn't have any color to it. So for raw data, what you want to do is for the RGB primaries, when you scroll down here, instead of defaults, switch it over to raw. And for your color space transfer, it can stay from 3ds Max. Now, normal maps, on the other hand, they are, again, datas, but we have to change something. Namely, this thing stays to raw, but the color space, unlike our other one, or our bump map, which stays from max, this one needs to be at none. So by keeping this color space transfer to none, we are not changing any of the gamma settings for it. So in this case, this actually looks correct. So these are the 3 types of maps you need to set up before you start using ACES in your renderings. Now, there is a 4th one as well, and in my case here, I have my scene lit up with 3 different lights, but in this case, I only have one of them active as a HDRI, and that HDRI is over here. And here we go. So here, if I go increase the rendering multiplier, you can see it increases the color. But what we want to do here is we want to set up the proper RGB color space to be on sRGB primaries, and the color space transfer function here needs to be at inverse gamma. So this is set up by default, so if you haven't changed it, everything should look just fine. So you shouldn't have any problems with this. So now, having done all of these things, and if you followed along, your scene should be set up for rendering within the ACES workflow, or with the ACES workflow. So in the future videos, if I go ahead and create something and I basically tell you that this was made with the ACES workflow in mind, you will know how to go ahead and replicate that same result that I'm using. And in your scenes, you can also use this thing to get a much more vibrant look. Now, another thing that I do want to mention is that if you don't want to use the ACES, you don't have to. There is a way around it, but it's going to be just a step or an extra step that you might have to do. But it's actually very doable. And the way that you would go about it is you go over to your display settings, and you just need to add in a filmic tone map. Now, the filmic tone map, as we said at the beginning of this video, is that what ACES does, it will change the filmic tone map from the 2.2 gamma more towards a S shape. So you can try to wiggle around with the shoulder strength, linear strength, and the toe strength to get a more contrasty look. But to make it simpler, if you use the ACES workflow, it will always be the same on no matter which project you're using. And one of the things that is the best thing about this, which we will probably see in the following videos, is that ACES deals incredibly well with hotspots, places where you have color burnout, as well as giving us much more contrast in the shadows as well as the color. So all in all, ACES should be something that you should have in your arsenal of skills, and you can choose whether or not you're going to use it for all of your future projects. All right, so here we are at the end of our video. And before we finish, I want to show you two different renders. One is going to be the sRGB workflow render. As you can see, it is a brighter look, and the colors looked more washed out. It doesn't have that much contrast, and it's especially visible in the shadow portion of our rendering. Now, the second one is going to be our ACES workflow. Now, as you can see over here, the colors are much more contrasty. The shadows are much well defined, much more darker, and it's making the entire image look a bit more contrasty and vibrant, and it making it look more appealing to the eyes. Now, since it's actually making the entire image darker, what we can do is, again, we can increase the light coming into our scene. And since we're using ACES, ACES will basically combat the need, the innate need that Vray has to create those hotspots, which will mean that you will be spared to not have to deal with hotspots and color burnouts, but at the same time, it will keep all of those nice colors that you're getting, as well as the darker shadows. So all in all, that's a win for ACES.